Welcome to News from Neptune for July 26th in the 30th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in Karl Marx's sense in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China, notably. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things, on a Mueller Time Out edition of News from Neptune. In hours of televised testimony before congressional committees this week, Robert Mueller, the special counsel overseeing an investigation into allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election and related matters, that's his title, seemed unwilling or unable to give the Democrats a basis for impeaching the president. Why are the Democrats, and much of the larger political establishment, so intent on replacing or at least neutralizing Trump? What seems to be at stake is the continuation of the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the Obama and previous administrations, which the Democrat Party, working for their elite sponsors, demands. Those policies consciously produced an accelerating concentration of wealth in the hands of the U.S. elite and increased war provocations against Russia and China. Trump, riding the populist wave, was the first major party candidate in 40 years to attack those policies. Though in office, he succumbed to pressures from the permanent government to maintain them. We will consider some of the implications of this tonight, and we'll begin with David Green.
Okay, well, my favorite ride at Disneyland when I used to go there in my youth was Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and so I'm going to take you on a little bit of a Mr. Toad's Wild Ride around the bends and curves of identity politics this morning. But this is very serious.
We upset people with that.
Yes, and it's very serious. This is probably the most serious thing, the most serious at a somewhat personal level thing I've ever said on this show that didn't have to do with Israel and Palestine, even though it does, in a sense, have to do with Israel and Palestine. Where to start? Let's start at the beginning of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. I came across an article on Counterpunch this week called "Whitewashing American History: The WPA Mural Controversy in San Francisco" by Jack Heyman. Did you read this, Carl?
I did, and we talked about it on the Aware on the Air program.
Oh, good.
2 weeks ago.
Not
this article, but the
controversy.
Yes.
Okay. And let me just give you a little preview, so as you go through Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, you at least know where it's going to end up. Social justice warriors, woke people, those who call themselves anti-racist, have a national group called Standing Up Against, I'm sorry. Standing Up, well, anyway, I'm confusing myself here already. SURJ, Okay, let me just read this from Jack Heyman. There has been a controversy percolating the last couple of years over protests against the quote-unquote Life of Washington murals painted in 1935-36 by Works Progress Administration WPA artist Victor Arnautoff that are on display at George Washington High School, and I meant to say standing up for racial justice. That's what the
Showing up.
Showing up for racial justice. Okay. Murals painted by the WPA artist Victor Arnautoff at George Washington High School in San Francisco. These murals dared to challenge the patriotic stereotype of Washington, instead portraying him as a slaveholder and military commander overseeing the genocide of American Indians, seeking to portray the brutal reality of U.S. history, a reality that the ruling class and textbooks have always sought to falsify and obscure. The radical artist was in many ways far ahead of his time. Yet now the San Francisco Board of Education has voted to obliterate this militantly anti-racist artist depiction of history that the racist rulers sought to deny. The argument justifying this censorship is that the images were disturbing to students, quote unquote, disturbing. The threat of freedom of expression and free speech is real, and its real targets are the left, labor, and those who understand that historical truth is a weapon for the oppressed and exploited. Here, this vital freedom is being undermined not only by white supremacists and Trump, but by identity politics Democrats, quote-unquote identity politics. A petition signed by more than 400 academics and educators from across the country and around the world calls for saving the Arnautoff murals. Historian activist Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, author of An Indigenous People's History of the United States, warned, quote, the liberal campaign, and notice she says liberal campaign, to destroy the Arnautoff timeline parallels the age of Trump that has found liberal Democrats invoking founding fathers, the Constitution, American values as patriotic. As patriotic, Hamilton, the musical, has been introduced at a lightning rate in public school curricula. I think it's possible that there is actually a deep well, and this is a real important sentence. I think it's possible, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, distinguished historian of the genocide against the indigenous peoples, I think it is possible that there is actually a deep well of U.S. patriotism that lurks behind the anti-mural campaign. So standing up for racial justice is the group referred to in this article that's behind this mural controversy. The San Francisco branch of SURJ is behind this controversy. The local branch, the Champaign-Urbana branch of SURJ, is headed by a woman named Elizabeth Simpson. And she has promoted a couple of events in the last year which help people to understand how they're racist. One is, let me see here. Okay, I'm gonna. You can look up on the CURJ or SURJ Facebook page to find out about these events that they've had at the Unitarian Universalist Church that attempt to train people not to be racist. And what I'm arguing here is that is an extremely insidious quality. I say insidious advisedly. I say reactionary advisedly. I say proto-fascist advisedly of the manner in which this group is treating racial issues and the way this connects to other aspects of the identity politics left, of the liberal left. I'm connecting this to issues that we've dealt with on the program in the past. The talks that we've had about Nina Paley and the transgender groups. The talks that we've had about identity politics in general. Very relevant to this last week, or in many previous weeks, I've been talking about the debate over the history of the New Deal, Was the New Deal racist? I reference here an important interview on the podcast Dead Pundits Society, a good interview with the fellow, a estimable geographer, historian named Richard Walker, Dick Walker from California, about the New Deal. And it's relevant here, obviously, because these murals are from the New Deal. Was the New Deal racist? Are these murals racist? We can talk about the racial aspects of the New Deal, as Dick Walker does in a very considered way. But the New Deal wasn't racist in the crude sense that it's being talked about these days. And that's important to understand in a historical sense and consider that understanding as we talk about these murals and the reason why in San Francisco they're being challenged on the grounds of anti-racism. Now, it's true that this debate has been going on apparently since the 1960s, when Black Panthers apparently found these murals to be disturbing. But still, I think it's an important debate, and it relates to the whole social justice, identity politics, people of color debate, and what is to be done about these issues in a very concrete local political way. A year ago in June, I attended an anti-ICE rally out on North Prospect. I was happy to attend that. There is a rally or an event going on this weekend, the No More Cages rally or event in Urbana. At this point, I would declare that I'm having nothing to do with these things because of the coalition, the nature of the Democratic Liberal coalition that is supporting this. There is a group called CU Progressives, CUP. It's run by a woman, Marcy Adelston Schaefer, who's been identified with the Bend the Arc group. And just as these racial justice warriors have a subliminal agenda, these liberals and Democrats have, especially when they come from a Jewish background and are presenting themselves as supporting Jewish values without mentioning Israel and Palestine. I don't want to align myself with them under these auspices. I don't want to align myself in any way, shape, or form with the standing up for racial justice group, and not just because they have a different agenda, because I think it's a basically reactionary agenda. And let me just read one more thing, Carl, here.
Sure.
The SURJ statement that they use at their workshops in order to challenge white supremacy culture, as they had a workshop here late last year. It's the subtitle of this is From Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups by Kenneth Jones, who now turns out to be the late Kenneth Jones, because this was from 2001, and a woman named Tema Oken, who had an organization or have one called Change Work. Let me just read this, and this gets back to the issue of what happened at Evergreen State that Nina Paley has on her website. You watch these movies, these 3 half-hour movies about what happened at Evergreen State in 2017, and we should be scared by these things. One of the things on this list about objectivity, these are things you shouldn't have if you're fighting racial justice. Objectivity, I don't even believe this, but it's true. The belief that there is such a thing, what they're challenging in the standing up for racial justice is, bullet point, the belief that there is such a thing as being objective. Bullet point. The belief that emotions are inherently destructive, irrational, and should not play a role in decision making or group process. Bullet point, invalidating people who show emotion. Bullet point, requiring people to think in a linear fashion and ignoring or invalidating those who think in other ways. Bullet point, impatience with any thinking that does not appear logical to those with power. What are the antidotes to objectivity? Realize that everybody has a worldview and that everybody's worldview affects the way they understand things. Realize this means you too. Push yourself to sit with discomfort when people when people are expressing themselves in ways that are not familiar to you. Assume that everybody has a valid point, and your job is to understand what that point is. This is the worst of all these things. All of them aren't completely awful, but you're training people's minds to oppose racism in a way that's supporting fascism. A hallmark of fascism is rejecting the rational. We should understand that. I mean, the word's been thrown around so much lately. But go back and look at the irrational component of fascism. It's unbelievable that people, that supposedly liberal, progressive members of this community are abiding this sort of nonsense. And it's become part and parcel with the pro-immigrant movement. Sadly, for the I'm not saying it's becoming part and parcel overtly, but the coalition of groups that's supporting these liberal, Democrat, progressive groups that have grabbed onto this cause, this is what the background of this is.
Here is a description that, as I say, we began on the program Aware on the Air 2 weeks ago of the incidents that prompts David's reflections. The decision of the San Francisco School Board to obliterate the historic murals in George Washington High School is not just another instance of identity politics foolishness. I think this is David's point, and I think that's quite right. Identity politics looks like foolishness in many cases, but it turns out to have a more malign character in some circumstances. And in this particular case, it's not resulting in just foolishness. It's also a terrifying illustration of the drastic mental decline of what is called the left. Back in the 1930s, there was a left that had brains. You could agree or disagree with it. You could love it or hate it, but it had ideas, purpose, talent, and a sense of common humanity. It was working for a just society that would end exploitation and benefit humanity as a whole. As an example, there were the artistic projects of the Works Progress Administration, the principal New Deal program to combat the Depression, which extended from creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority to artistic enhancement of public buildings. A beneficiary of this enhancement was George Washington High School in San Francisco, which was blessed with a striking set of murals by a leading artist, Victor Alnatov, a Russian immigrant who had worked with a Mexico master of socially conscious mural art, Diego Rivera. One would expect that the presence of such powerful murals would be a lasting cause of pride in their school for staff and students. The WPA, not least in its art projects, was animated by leftists and even downright communists, like Arnautoff, who chose to depart from the sterilized "I cannot tell a lie" cherry tree myth and the crossing of the Delaware glorification of George Washington to introduce reminders of the forgotten victims of the foundings of the United States, the exploitation of African slaves, and the violent expropriation of Native American lands. The murals were clearly part of the left-wing WPA intellectuals' endeavor to raise social consciousness, a step towards the civil rights movement of the 1950s. I must admit, in my lifetime, I've come to realize how much the 1950s did to obliterate the leftist activities of Americans before the Second World War. And this is a certain example of that. In the age of the House Un-American Activities Committee and Joe McCarthy's drunken rampage of the 1950s, such red-tinged WPA projects exposing the less glorious side of the birth of the Republic aroused hostile suspicion. And yet the Arnautoff murals survived Nixon, HUAC, and McCarthy witch hunts. It took identity politics to call for their destruction. What is most shocking is that the African-American president of the San Francisco Board of Education, Stephen Cook, supports this destruction of the murals on grounds that they include, quote, violent images that are offensive to certain communities, close quote.
This is book banning, you know. This is the artistic version of book banning.
Jolie Proudfoot, director of the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center in San Marcos, said it was not worth saving the art if one native student, quote, is triggered by that, close quote. Everything is wrong with such a position. Education should include teaching people to analyze what they see rather than simply be triggered. The contemporary world is crammed with images that are deeply offensive. When a student can have an historic mural torn down because she or he is triggered by it, what sort of preparation is this for the future? School should not be a safe place for emotions, but a preparation for using reason to master those emotions as one goes through life. The protesters have chosen the worst possible way of interpreting the murals instead of using their reason to understand them and place them in their context. And that context, of course, is not both the founding of the United States and the 1930s. Yes, slavery happened, and yes, American Indians were slaughtered, and their descendants can think of the strength they needed to resist and survive, and draw from their tragic history a sense of compassion for all who suffer from comparable injustice today. The attack on the mural is a gesture of impotent spite. What are the hurt feelings of a San Francisco high school student compared to the pain and hunger of a Yemeni child living under U.S.-supported bombing? George Washington is dead, but in the city named after him, American leaders are sponsoring the massacre of innocent civilians all around the world. Why don't these super-sensitive American students use their super-sensitivity to oppose such ongoing crimes and develop their intelligence to figure out how to join with others in fighting to end the permanent war state in Washington? But the snowflake trend has no use for real strength, the strength of courage to overcome obstacles, and draws an artificial moral strength from perpetual emotional weakness. Instead of gaining strength from increased knowledge, a certain tendency of young persons who have not suffered as their forebears did cling to their victimhood as a key to their own privileges. This may bring a few momentary advantages, but is disastrous in the long run. A healthy society is based on a balance between respect for the individual, regardless of identity or origins, and awareness of belonging to humanity as a whole, with all its sufferings, joys, tragedies, and aspirations. Closing oneself into a limited identity group denies both respect for individuals and awareness of universal humanity. It can only be a basis for endless conflict, quote, my people are better than your people, close quote. No, my people are better than your people, close quote. Those who win a momentary victory by imposing on others a destructive act of iconoclasm are only confirming their identification as losers as their sole key to success. With such divisions, the American people will be absorbed in tribal skirmishes while their criminal rulers continue to spread devastation around the world. And it's important to see the distracting function of this sort of identity politics from that very spread of destruction around the world. Identity politics is not just an addition to American ruling class ideology, it is a defense of it. And if we don't see that, I think we're up to make very great mistakes, like destroying the murals in San Francisco.
I just, this is what this is the statement for the the caging event tomorrow that they have on their Facebook page. This is not some faraway issue with no bearing on our town. The fact is, children are already arriving here bearing the psychological scars of having been kept in those cages at the border. These are children legally seeking asylum. At the same time, ICE is conducting indiscriminate nationwide sweeps. While raids are unlikely to occur in CU, many people are threatened to be arrested after having their asylum cases denied. These people are trucking in this issue as a kind of front for their identity politics agenda. These people don't have a coherent political agenda. They support the Democratic Party. You look at the names, you look at the group sponsoring it, you look at what their relationships are. I can no longer support actions like this. This is as well. Well, you go along with our stuff, or we'll go along with your stuff, and you go along, along with our stuff. Well, there was a anti-war against Iran rally a couple of weeks ago, and 10 or 15 people from the radical Marxist and DSA groups showed up. And okay, there was one person there representing the progressive Democrats, which I guess is different from this CU progressive thing. I mean, it's hard to know how they all lay out, but it's just there isn't a coherent left in this. There isn't a substantial coherent left, and if there is, it needs to separate themselves of those groups that are cohering to make statements like this about cages, but not necessarily opposing U.S. foreign policy that made Honduras what it is and created this crisis. I mean, there's just this idea that if it's going to affect us. Well, what if it wasn't going? I mean, so what if it's not? There's a whole world of U.S. foreign policy out there that these people just aren't bothered by. And again, I'm particularly sensitive to the idea that people promote their Jewishness and their Jewish values in the name of some of these things while never saying a word about Israel-Palestine. And that generalizes in terms of not saying a word about U.S. foreign policy. People are just being drawn back into the Democratic Party orbit with these things. Some lines are going to have to be drawn because clearly, again, there's a kind of proto-fascistic element to this.
You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about events in the local community that are bound up with fundamental political situations in the U.S. and in the world at large. David, do you object to participating in the anti-cages rally that's going on in town tomorrow, even if you have differences, which you set out quite clearly with some of the people behind it? Don't you think the rally itself is still a good idea, given the scandalous behavior of the government?
Well, like I said, a year ago in June, I felt that way when they had the rally out of North Prospect. But I'm so annoyed and frustrated and disgusted and appalled by some of these people that I don't want to join with them anymore, because I feel like I'm being used by them. I feel like anybody who just wants to be a good person has to, I'm not saying that they're making anybody sign up to their statement or to their anti-racism, but I see these people as useless.
But the immigration policies and behavior of the current government are so outrageous that surely someone who believes in open borders, say, and things like this should be public about the criticism of what the government is actually doing.
I guess if I was not letting my feelings get involved in this, as they obviously are, if I was just being as the anti-racist culture, I mean, they're telling me I can go with my feelings. What about my feelings? Okay, so I understand what you're saying, and if I was in a different place, I couldn't get myself into a mental place to want to go to this sort of rally. I really couldn't, because I don't think the left has been the anti-war left has been involved in planning, in even planning this rally. And when the anti-war left gets involved in planning this rally, these are some of the people, Marcy, Adelson, Schaefer, and so forth, who don't want anything to do with us. So that may sound petty and childish, guilty as charged, perhaps, but we've got to get our perspectives straight here if we're going to be effective in the bigger picture and not just supposedly putting out fires when it comes to the people coming from south of our border.
I've got something else here that may aid your perspective on the Democratic Party or support your perspective on the Democratic Party.
I can use it. I can use whatever you got.
Well, this one I think is particularly nefarious. Actually, I'm quoting a correspondent who writes, overall, the Pew Research Center found in 2016 that Democratic voters in 2016 were 57% white, 21% black, and 12% Hispanic. The remaining voters were Asian American and other ethnicities. Close quote. If we go by strict demographics, this person writes, Medicare for all and possibly open borders would be fine, democratically worthy policies to run on. But, and this is a sympathizer of the Democratic Party, as will be clear, if we want to address the needs of the truly disenfranchised, we should ask them what they want. Sounds more like Medicare for all who don't have other coverage. It's called the public option, if you're keeping score, is what our brown neighbors would prefer, and we need those neighbors to show up next November. Now look what's being said. This is outrageous. This is just incredible. On the basis of identity politics, that is what brown people and Indian people and foreigners and so forth, as well as white people, have to say, the obvious seriousness of the Medicare for all that's been introduced by some Democrats and strongly opposed by other Democrats because they're working for the medical establishment, that proposal should be set aside on the grounds that it's not clear that brown people want it. Now that's just remarkable. I mean, instead of talking about the political education that doesn't take place in this country, the real situation of health care and the provision of health care, instead we try to make an argument here on the basis of what some people who have particular identities may have been, perhaps misleadingly, asserting about this matter. To say that the public option, which is part of the a discarded part of the Obamacare, the public option is to be preferred for to Medicare for all, is what the Democratic Party establishment wants, and it is now basing its support for that on a supposed hesitation on the part of identified communities, black people, who have doubts about the efficacy of the Medicare for All program. Now, this is not only disingenuous, it's not only an outright lie, it also is a particularly sneaky way to try to propose and support what the Democratic Party organization wants, which is Obamacare, if you like, and no Medicare for all, no health care for all that would be taken for granted in other countries. The disingenuousness, to put no finer point on it, of the Democratic argument is an example of what identity politics can do for us if we let it.
Yeah, I guess the word of the day that I would invoke would be co-optation. I'm tired of being co-opted. I'm tired of people saying, "Well, this is a good cause. What do you have against it?" The understanding that there's things we can work together with. But in the bigger picture, when you're trying to deal with some of the fundamental transformative issues that we need to be talking about, this just doesn't work for me anymore. And I'm going to probably end up, I wouldn't say I'm going to end up losing friends. They're not my friends. But at least they're people that might harbor some bit of affection for me at some at some distant level, but there's just a lot of ignorance around these issues, and there's a lot of assuming that what the left is. I know in this whole evergreen state thing, the two protagonists in this, a couple who was persecuted at Evergreen State, Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Heying, who were evolutionary biologists at Evergreen State, were hounded out of their jobs, and they're just normal progressive people. They don't really understand what the left is, but now they think the left is the identity politics left. They think the left is the woke left. So that now they're involved on the quote-unquote dark web, with these people like Jordan Peterson and so forth, because there's no real left to help. I mean, they could look for it if they wanted to, but there's no left to kind of look at them, and there isn't a left that's going to oppose what was going on at Evergreen State, just like there wasn't a left that was going to support except locally, but Nina Paley's whole business with Bob Naiman, and that was fine. But Nina Paley didn't have a left support group because everybody was too busy, being nice to the transgender people. Just a big confusing mess that so few people seem to find their way out of, because aren't these just nice people who want their rights, blah, blah, blah. One glaring contradiction here in all this mess is that the same as where a black woman couldn't, a white woman couldn't declare that she's black, whereas a man can declare that he is woman. There are, in this anti-racist business, there are these statements about having safe spaces for people of color, for POCs, amidst certain, it's like you've got to offer childcare and then you've got to offer safe spaces. Whereas what Nina Paley and others were arguing about trans people is that women in prison or women in shelters need safe spaces, whereas the pro-trans people were saying, no, a man who says he's female should be able to go into these spaces. So it gets convoluted. I know it's a minor point, but you just notice all of these crisscrossing, sort of ironic contradictions that make a big mess of the whole thing.
The defensible heart of identity politics is its commitment to opposing forms of discrimination like racism, sexism, and homophobia. I share that commitment, but opposing discrimination today has no more to do with a left politics than do equally powerful ethical commitments against, say, violence or dishonesty. Why? Because the core of a left politics is its critique of and resistance to capitalism, its commitment to decommodifying education, health care, and housing, and creating a more economically just society, an economically equal society. Neither hostility to discrimination nor the accompanying enthusiasm for diversity makes the slightest contribution to accomplishing any of those goals. Just the opposite, in fact. They function instead to provide inequality with a meritocratic justification. If everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, there's no injustice when some people fail. We've been arguing that identity politics is not an alternative to class politics, but a form of it. It's the politics of an upper class and a Democratic Party that has no problem with seeing people left behind as long as they haven't been left behind because of their race or sex. That's why elite institutions like universities make an effort to recruit black people, as well as white, into the ruling class. They're seeking to legitimate the class structure, not abolish it. A legitimate class structure is saying, yes, we got black folks and white folks too, therefore it must be okay. We got women as well as men, but it's the same class structure. Of course, if we're going to accept a ruling class, one that's open to people other than straight white men is preferable. But shouldn't the left be more committed to doing something for the vast majority of people of all races, genders, and sexual orientations who will never belong to that class? We've never thought the fact that a few white people get to become rich was a victory for poor white people. So why should substituting in a few black people change the equation? It's not racism that creates the differences between classes. It's capitalism. And it's not anti-racism that can combat the difference. It's socialism. We're frequently told that black poverty is worse than white poverty, more isolating, more concentrated, and maybe that's true. But why politically should it matter? You don't build the left by figuring out which victim has been most victimized. You build it by organizing all the victims. When it comes to the value of universal health care, for example, we don't need to worry for a second about whether the black descendants of slaves are worse off than the white descendants of coal miners. The goal is not to make sure that black people are no sicker than white people. It's to make everybody healthy. That's why it's called universal. Discrimination is neoliberalism's theory of inequality. Even poor whites have started to buy it. A large number appear to think that anti-white bias is their real problem. Obviously, they're wrong, but when, as notable historians point out, the language of victimization has become so impoverished that it consists of nothing but discrimination, you go with what you got. A new left politics will need to change that. Instead of a more complicated understanding of identity, of race, sex, and intersectionality, that opiate of the professional managerial class, we need a more profound understanding of exploitation. That's a comment by Walter Ben Michaels from a few years ago. It seems to me that to suggest exactly what's right and wrong about identity politics and just how dangerous it is to a serious left politics that gets at the root of our social problems, which is not discrimination, but exploitation.
There's something about the nature, perhaps I would propose, there's something about the nature of social media that's provoking a lot of these bad ideas.
That's an interesting point.
You know, I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems like if people were willing to read longer form articles and actually have some scholarly depth in what they do, they may come to understand some of these issues in a very different framework. But as long as they just want to feel good about themselves and have little messages and have little bullet points about things so that they don't feel like they're the one who's being racist, then I don't know how we're going to carry on a conversation with some of these people. We just have to hope that there's enough people who want to think some of these things through, and have some respect, however complicated it is, for what the scholarly literature and the political discourse is about these things. But that isn't what these people are doing. That isn't what I don't think Elizabeth Simpson cares about any of these arguments. She's never heard of them. She's convinced of her absolute righteousness, and we're going to have to move beyond people like that.
We must say that for the local people we have mentioned,
join us. Right? Let's.
They have an open invitation and right of reply, so to speak, and we would be happy to have any of them come in and discuss these matters with that. So it's important that there be discussions about this, and it's rather disturbing how much the partisans of identity politics want to shut down discussions or scrape murals off walls.
And in the background is always Donald Trump. People are going to say, well, what about Trump? What about Trump? Yeah. And this is, ever since we've been talking about this, for 3 years now, it's like, what about Trump? What about Trump? Well, we see what's happened. We see what's happened in relation to this Never Trump movement, this hashtag resistance movement. We see it's gotten, as Trump has gone on and on and on, it's got dumber and dumber and dumber and dumber.
It's interesting in this connection to reflect on the campaign against Trump in the 2016 presidential election and how the Democrats chose to form that campaign. It takes a moment, but it's worth reflecting what's going on here. What the Democrats were really concerned about in the Trump campaign was the attacks on neoliberalism and neoconservatism, that is, more war and more austerity, that were the fundamental policies of the Obama administration. But obviously, the Clinton campaign couldn't come out and say, we favor more war and we favor more austerity, more inequality in this country. Well, they came pretty close to saying it in what Mrs. Clinton was saying about Syria and what they were saying about various social proposals, including Medicare for all. Now, in that circumstance, they had to find some way to say why and how they were defending neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the Obama administration, and they did it by saying that they were speaking up for those discriminated against in the society, and that women, black people, foreigners of various sites, sexual minorities, and so forth. These were the people that they were speaking up for, according to the Clinton campaign, when in fact what they were doing was producing an argument for more war and more inequality. And the disingenuousness of that Clinton campaign is carried over to what the Democrats have been doing since then, and the way in which the demands of a populist public for economic and social relief are set aside in favor of saying, oh, but we're in favor of the people who are being discriminated against. That's the Democratic Party's attempt to say, as we've seen in the most recent attempt to reject Medicare for all on the grounds that it's not clear that black people want it. That's incredible. I would not have believed that that was possible, but that's where the modern-day Democratic Party is.
Yeah, and I just think people don't believe that people who claim to be anti-racist could be as bad as all that. But as Hillary Clinton famously said, is something to the effect of, well, is giving everybody universal health care going to end racism?
Yeah.
But just the idea that people have a worldview that the problems of the world, the social problems of the world, begin with people's attitudes. Like attitudes pop up like mushrooms, and we can just kill those mushrooms, and then everything will be better. Well, that isn't how you explain history. That isn't how you explain fundamental issues of social and economic inequality. It's just these are basic things, and so much of people who think of themselves as right-thinking people just don't get it. But anyway, I've gone on and on about this.
As Gerald Ford said, I could go on and on, but you know the facts. Well, in fact, you do. And for that very reason, the Democratic Party and the political establishment in general are at great pains to cover those facts over.
Yeah, well, I mean, one more fact I was going to say, just we need to throw this in because we talked about the whole issue about Ayanna Pressley, the congresswoman from your old district in Massachusetts,
right.
And she was accorded status in the squad, and now she's dropped out of the squad, as you may have heard, to a certain extent because she voted for the anti-boycott, divestment, sanctions bill that went through Congress or through the House. And it's clear it wasn't surprising at all to me that she did that. So we've got 3/4 of the squad left, and I'm sure Presley will join them in other issues, but not the Israel-Palestine issue. And one of the things I get so upset about this whole thing is that over the last few years, I've seen people nod their caps to the idea that something needs to be done about Israel-Palestine. But as long as these people who think that they now support the Palestinians are are allying with these people who support identity politics, nothing's going to happen with the Palestinian issue, especially when you have someone like Marcy Adelston Schaefer, who is clearly one of these Jewish people who wants to be socially righteous and talk about anything else but what's being done, quote unquote, in her name.
The case of Representative Presley from Massachusetts, well, the dissident member, if you like, of the squad, the young black representative who has been the object of the president's ire. I've been skeptical of her from the beginning, part because I lived for a while in her in her district, or in the area actually. She was an example of an identity politics candidate who was in fact a traditional Democratic Paul, as we say in Massachusetts, who displaced an anti-war vote. Representative Capuano, who for many years had been an anti-war vote in the House, they displaced him on the grounds that he was an old white man and she was a young black woman. That was, I wondered.
And we're not at all biased because we're old white men, are we?
No, I'm a young black woman.
Oh, right. Oh, that's right. If you say you are, then you are.
Presley was a question mark from the beginning. I was not surprised when she went over on this particular on the BDS vote.
I mean, if she's supporting the squad's issues, otherwise than that, I mean, fine, fine. But still, it shows what the cracks in that are. It shows what the limits and boundaries are in terms of how far you can go and how far the squad can go. It's bad enough to have 4, now you got 3.
You have been watching News from Neptune for the 30th week of 2019, a Mueller Time Out edition.
I think we've still got like 5 or 6 minutes.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, you go. I mean, I've been hogging the whole show. I haven't given you a chance to do anything.
Not at all. Go right ahead.
No, you go. You go ahead.
After you, Alphonse. You, Gaston.
You must have at least one thing you wanted to get in.
We have one point from our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson.
Give him. He does hard work for us. So.
Who does excellent work, and his notes will be on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. He has a number of things to mention this week. One that I thought, I continue to think, is important and perhaps really finally quite explosive, and that's the Seth Rich murder. Jeff writes that that Rich's murder is finally going to get some coverage, if only in alternative news that doesn't let the corporate narrative dictate what is considered news. And I must say, it is remarkable even to me that corporate news has done so much to obliterate the Seth Rich story. Now, it's no accident that the Mueller report did the same thing. It simply assumed there was nothing to it, and that has been very important for corporate media to make sure that the story does not get any play. The question here is, how did the DNC emails that caused such negative reaction to the Clinton campaign, how did that get in the public domain? How did it get to WikiLeaks, the object of the U.S. government's torture or the occasion for U.S. government's torture of Julian Assange? How did those emails get out? Well, if you read the Mueller report, which we were all supposed to do yesterday, I guess, you're told that it was very clear how they got out. Russian hackers got into the DNC email servers and delivered that stuff right away to WikiLeaks, which is a great crime because it was an attempt to influence the American election. The problem with this is that it can't be true. The WikiLeaks publication of these materials did not come from Russian hacking, but from someone in the Democratic National Committee who downloaded these emails to a thumb drive or something like that and passed them on to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has made a point of not revealing its sources, but it has said clearly from the beginning, the WikiLeaks group, Assange's group, has said clearly that these emails were not received from a government entity, i.e. from the Russians. What seems to have happened is that an employee of the DNC, a young man called Seth Rich, downloaded these matters and passed them on in the same way that the Manning and Snowden and others revealed materials that showed crimes being carried on by official government organizations. The article that appeared this week is by Ty Clevenger, the lawyer in the lawsuit that brings Seth Rich back in the news. The only place you could read about this in the U.S. was on RT, the Russian station. Former Fox News analyst Ellen Ratner relayed information from WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to Texas businessman Ed Butowski regarding Seth Rich's role in transferring the emails to WikiLeaks, according to an amended lawsuit that was filed this week on behalf of Mr. Bukowski. I'm having trouble with his name, not the Russian names. Ratner is also the former sister of Julian's deceased former attorney, Michael Ratner. Butowski says he met with Ellen Ratner and she told him Seth Rich was the source of the DNC email leaks. The amended lawsuit includes the DNC employee responsible for the leaks was Seth Rich, and he was assisted by his brother Aaron. Mr. Butowski does not know exactly when the DNC figured out that Mr. Rich was the source of the leak. On July 10, 2016, however, Mr. Rich was fatally shot while walking home in Washington, D.C., and the murder has not been solved. Mr. Butowski does not know whether the murder is related to Mr. Rich's role in leaking DNC emails. Butowski claims the negative press about Seth Rich's involvement, that is, Seth Rich is not involved, Russia did it, hurt Butowski's business. Available evidence to date shows the DNC emails were leaked from within, not hacked or obtained illicitly from outside via the internet. This being the case, it is increasingly curious that the matter has not been investigated by the relevant authorities, and the people with the greatest interest in not having it investigated is, of course, the DNC and the Clinton campaign. Much more to be said on this, but you're not hearing it in the American media. Thank goodness we have alternate media to talk about this matter, but the possibilities in the case, including the responsibility of the Clinton campaign and DNC for the murder of Seth Rich, cannot be overlooked.
Good job. Thank you, Jeff. More later.
Yes, indeed. More later, indeed. Whoops. You have been watching News from Neptune. For the 30th week of 2019, a Mueller Timeout edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Do see the research notes on the Facebook page from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come endures in my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.